Taliban recently resumed its spring offensive with multiple attacks and bombings. It's making territorial gains in Afghanistan and refusing to talk with the government. After almost 2 decades of fighting, what's the solution? Can the Taliban be defeated? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani offered Taliban unconditional talks in February, but the group responded by intensifying its attacks. It launched its spring offensive last month and stepped up its campaign against the government. Since then, there have been attacks in different parts of Afghanistan. Jennifer Glass reports from Farah city, where security forces recently pushed back an offensive by the Taliban.
4 days after the Taliban had them calling for reinforcements, the Afghan military in Farah city was lined up for a parade. The ministers of defense, interior, the head of the intelligence service, and the NATO commander are here to see what happened. The provincial governor, Abdullah said the army and police fought well, and Afghan special forces and international air and ground support came when called for. But the residents here didn't agree. Nematullah Battar says he lost 2 brothers in the fighting. He says local forces fought alone for 8 hours before reinforcements could come, while some officials fled with their bodyguards. Jamila Amini says all the women could do was pray. The Minister of Defense says it's the government's job to hear criticism, but says his forces are fighting against 20 terrorist groups, some supported by neighboring countries, that Afghanistan is the front line against terrorism. Belkis Roshan told the NATO commander a big problem is corruption on all sides, that not everyone wants peace.
We start with having the right leaders, and I agree with you. Some leaders did a good job, some did not.
This city of more than 50,000 people looks like it's getting back to normal, but the people are nervous. They don't want another Taliban attack. There was no sign of fighting, but a military convoy ferried journalists through the town on a brief visit.
We're just on the outskirts of Farah city, driving through the center of town. The streets are mainly deserted, not many cars or motorbikes around, but certainly signs of life. Some shops and marketplaces are open, and a real signal of progress. I saw trucks full of supplies coming into town.
The Ministry of Defense says 6 other provincial capitals are at risk of attacks from the Taliban. The military, with help from U.S. forces, may have prevailed here in Farah city, but there is likely a long summer of fighting ahead. Jennifer Glass, Al Jazeera, Farah city.
The Taliban was ousted from power in 2001 following the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, but the armed group didn't go away. Instead, it's been expanding its control on the ground. A report by SIGA, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, found that last year alone, Taliban took another 5% of government territory. And as of November, the government could only claim to have control or influence in fewer than 60% of districts. And that was significantly down since 2015, the year after the US and UK ended their combat mission. Taliban is now back in parts of Helmand province, where some of the bloodiest battles were fought. Let's now go to our guests. Joining us in Kabul, Habib Wardak, national security analyst. In Washington, D.C., Omar Samad, former senior advisor to the chief executive of Afghanistan, Abdullah. And in Dublin, Michael Semple, a visiting research professor at Queen's University, Belfast. He's also former deputy EU special representative to Afghanistan. Warm welcome to you all. Let me start by asking Mr. Habib Wardak this: why there has been so far no success or progress in establishing political talks between the different parties in Afghanistan?
Well, I don't think the Afghan government and its international allies understand who are they fighting in Afghanistan. They will have contradictory statements coming from them every now and then. The Afghan government, the presidential palace will say that it's a proxy war and Taliban's all proxies of the Afghan neighbors. Now we have the Peace Council in Kabul whose job is basically to bring in the Taliban into the peace and negotiating table. Now, if you believe that this is a proxy war and Taliban all proxy, then why are we even talking to the Taliban? Why not talk to the masters of the proxy? And if we are to believe that Taliban or Afghans, it's a local insurgency, then this idea of having a high peace council dedicated to bring in Taliban into negotiating table will make sense. I think it's very important for the Afghan government as well as the international community to understand who Taliban really are. You know, who are they?
I see your point. Mr.
And until and unless we don't really understand that.
Mr. Samad, the President Ashraf Ghani has offered unconditional talks with the Taliban. However, that didn't work. Why do you think so?
Well, it's odd and somewhat tragically funny that after 20 years, we claim as Afghans and then our international colleagues as well that we don't know who the Taliban are, who they represent, whether they're proxies, whether they're local insurgency. I would say that it's a mix of different factors that have played into this, and every stakeholder is obviously pursuing their strategies in their interests, depending on one day using it as a proxy, one day claiming that it's an insurgency. So there's confusion, obviously, because this is the nature of this particular conflict. As far as your question is concerned, I think that the olive branch that Ashraf Ghani extended to the Taliban recently, which was probably the most generous so far, in terms of allowing the Taliban to come back to Afghanistan, resettle, be safe, and even take part in politics, in the country's politics, and discuss issues that have to do with the constitution or amendments or anything like that, has not been accepted or welcomed. There has been total silence, but at the same time, on the ground, the reality is that the Taliban have unleashed probably one of the most ferocious offensives against the Afghan government as well as their backers. And this has led to many, many lives being lost, especially among civilians. It has hurt Afghanistan, and it has created an unstable situation where trust, which is so important to any type of peace building, has eroded, and there's very little trust nowadays.
Michael, before we go into the details of the political process in Afghanistan and the way out of the conflict in Afghanistan, is there any genuine appetite for political talks from the different parties, from the Afghan government, from the international community, the Americans in particular, and from the Taliban?
On the Taliban side, the Taliban leadership has consistently declined all invitations to negotiate with the Afghan government. They claim they'd like to sit down with the Americans. I'm not sure if that's even a genuine desire. I think we can conclude that the Taliban leadership for now believes that it can improve its position by continuing the fight. The Afghan government has made a series of offers and sense efforts to try and to get the Taliban into talks. I'm sure that they do want to see talks and a negotiated end, but it's not perhaps quite so clear how far they are prepared to compromise, or indeed to be creative in finding ways to bring this about. As for the Americans, this war isn't breaking the bank in the US, but it's inconvenient and unhelpful for them. They would like to see an end to this conflict.
Habib, you were basically saying at the beginning that the problem is to define, first of all, whether and determine whether the Taliban are a proxy or not. But at the same time, the Taliban consider the government a puppet administration which is manipulated by the Americans. Therefore, they say that we will only talk ultimately with the Americans, not with the government.
Well, yes, both sides consider each side illegitimate. That's for sure. But if we are really to talk about peace in Afghanistan, I think none of the sides are very genuine about having peace in Afghanistan. If you look at the government of Afghanistan, they have set up this this cosmetic council called the Afghanistan High Peace Council. And all of those members of the peace councils are people who were directly or indirectly engaged with the Taliban. And then if you look at the Taliban side, you have those hawkish Taliban who are taking orders straight from organizations or nation states outside Afghanistan. Farah was a good example. It had nothing to do with Farah or the Afghan people. It had to do with water. If you look at it, none of the sides are genuine. Not the Afghan government, not the Taliban. You have people within each sector who have vested interest in war, not in peace. And this is what makes this Afghan war invincible. It has been going on for the past 18 years, and probably it'll keep going on for a lot of more years. Until and unless you have genuine intentions, you need to have people in the High Peace Council who are fair, who are neutral, who are not part of the Afghan conflict, who can then do all of the confidence building measures that we talk about, who could then maybe have the environment of a temporary ceasefire, which could then pave the way for a sustainable peace. At the moment, I don't think none of the sides are sort of dedicated to have a sustainable peace in Afghanistan.
Omar, after almost 17 years, countries still bogged down in the same vicious cycle of violence. The Taliban are expanding their influence. The government is seen as inefficient, battling corruption at all sides of the branches of the government. What do you think should be the first genuine practical step to be taken in the near future to start a real political process in Afghanistan?
Well, we are in the middle of a policy that is being implemented. As you remember, last year the U.S. announced its South Asia policy, and it has some very specific objectives to meet. The Afghan government has been talking about fighting and also being willing to talk. You know, the Afghan conflict, which is now, again, is more than 20 years old. It's not just since the United States came in. This fight was going on before 9/11. And there was no U.S., there were no other countries that were very heavily involved, even though it has always had a regional flavor to it. But look at it, there's one part of it which is to some extent organic, meaning that it is Afghanistan related. And there are issues amongst Afghans that have to be resolved, and Afghans have to talk to each other about that. But then, unfortunately, and your other guests also
like the ethnic divide, for example, Mr. Omar?
Type warfare going on.
Like the ethnic divide?
The ethnic divide is something that ethnic divide is a very divisive tool that is used by those who think that by prodding one ethnicity against the other, they can have their interests met, and Afghans can be engaged in battle amongst each other. I don't consider the Afghan war as being an ethnic war. I don't think that the Afghan people, whether in one ethnicity or the other, would like to be engaged or have ethnic warfare claims. I think that yes, ethnicity plays a role at a certain point, but it's a tool that has been used by outsiders to prod Afghans against Afghans. But the other side is that yes, this is a regional. There are regional implications and dimensions to this war. Not even regional, even going beyond regional. It's not just the neighbors.
Okay.
And I think that Afghanistan risks becoming another battleground. And what we need to do first, to get to your question, is we need to prevent Afghanistan from becoming another major proxy battleground.
Mr. Michael, I mean, before we go into the regional implications, the presence of the Islamic State in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, Omar was talking about the ethnic element in this story, which is basically the ongoing divide between the Tajiks and the Pashtuns. If this continues, if this divisive issue continues, how do you see the future of the country?
From our discussion so far, I think it's good that we've laid it out there that there is a conflict economy with lots of actors on both sides of this war who see an advantage, see crude profit in continuing the fighting. That's true. However, I think we should also look towards the common ground, which is the majority of Afghans, and that includes people who are lined up on the Taliban side and those who are broadly aligned with the government. They know that this war is hurting them. They know that there's no prospect of a decent life in Afghanistan until the war is ended. And that gives you some pretty strong common ground. There is real war fatigue on both sides of this, and nobody is fighting to split off from Afghanistan, even if there are some ethnic elements to politics in Afghanistan. This is, as Umar is exactly right to say, this is not an ethnic conflict. There actually is a significant amount of common ground between the parties in this conflict, and if we see some more creative approaches to peacemaking, the prospects for Afghanistan actually are pretty good.
Habib, you've been mentioning the regional implication of the conflict, basically the Pakistani influence in Afghanistan. What can the Afghan government do to try to engage the Pakistanis to help bring about a permanent solution to the problem in Afghanistan?
Well, up to 2014, 2015, it was 2013, 14, 15, you had just the Pakistanis. But I think the problem is now much more complex than merely looking at Pakistan. You have Iran and Russia who are equally engaged into the Afghan conflict now. Farah was a good example yet again a week back. Farah was on the verge of being collapsed, just like Kunduz collapsed twice years back. Farah was a very good, classical example to Taliban being used as proxies by Iran. Primarily, they have differences with the Afghan government or the Afghan nation over water that flows into Iran. The problem is now beyond Pakistan. The Russian Federation has their own reservations. The Iranian government have their own reservations. That goes beyond water, IS, for example. And I think the Afghan government has sort of not done much to sort of have that confidence building measures with the Russian government and the Iranians to make them, to persuade them not to opt the policy what Pakistan had opted for years. And this is, I think, where the failure comes in. And this is where I think it kind of becomes more complex. And this is a trump card for the Taliban, because they're looking for nation states beyond Pakistan. And I think the government hasn't done much in this aspect.
Mr. Omar, you were a diplomat, and you know the regional implications, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Russians recently. What can the government do to look into all those conflicting agendas at the same time to try to give reassurances to all the parties involved in the Afghan conflict that their interest would be safeguarded in exchange for permanent solution to the crisis?
Well, just to start off, I want to say that when in government or outside government, over the last 17 years or so, I've been witness to the Afghan government genuinely really leaning all the way back to accommodate many of the demands that our neighbors have. And they have gone out of their way to try to reach out to Pakistan especially, and to others as well nowadays, maybe not enough. But I think more needs to be done. I don't think we're doing enough on the diplomatic front. I don't think it's just the Afghans. The Afghans are probably a weak link in all of this. I think the international community as a whole, the United States especially, needs to do more on the diplomatic front while fighting is going on. Unfortunately, fighting is going on because we are being attacked. The Afghan people are being attacked, and they have to be defended at any cost. And we have to go after the hubs of terrorism and violence that are inside and outside of Afghanistan. Without going after these hubs of violence inside and outside Afghanistan, I don't think that we can change the modalities, and everybody is going to be caught up in all of this. But eventually, we have to come up with a concept of a peaceful Afghanistan that serves everybody's interest, at least is not a threat to anybody's interests. And that formula hasn't shaped up yet, and I think we need to work on that formula.
Okay, Michael, the Russian envoy to Afghanistan has said basically that by not talking to the Afghans, the Americans put the whole region in a dead end. How do you see the comments of the Russian envoy, who's been really critical of the US policy in Afghanistan, saying that we've done that in the past, we had thousands of fighters, we lost many, and that the Americans need to listen?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure what the point is. I think all of us can agree that a stable, peaceful Afghanistan is, first of all, good for the people of Afghanistan itself. It will be helpful to the countries of the region in pursuing their own legitimate objectives. And of course, wow, there'd be quite a sigh of relief in the international community if we saw that peaceful Afghanistan. The point is making progress towards it, and just sniping at other actors is not going to help in that. I think that there's a risk of allowing this to become too complicated by worrying about all the the proxy relationships with Pakistan, with Russia and Iran. The point is to take the Taliban seriously, to take the politics of the Taliban seriously, to look for more creative ways to try and get the Taliban involved in a political process. And along the way, of course, as Umar was rightly pointing out there, taking the security piece seriously. I mean, the Taliban have launched a deadly offensive, and the Afghan security forces, backed by their allies, have got to be effective in pushing back against that. So the Afghan people need to be defended from the security threats they face now, and we need a serious political process engaging the Taliban.
Habib, as the conflict drags on, we're getting into new dimensions. Now the Islamic State is launching those daring attacks at the heart of the capital, Kabul, in different parts of the country. How do you see the future of the country if there's no political solution to the problem?
I think what we have in Afghanistan, the National Unity Government, it's a complete failure. They have lost more ground than the past 15 years. We have more civilian casualties. The latest SIGAR report states that we have 10% decrease in our Afghan national security forces. The poverty rate has hiked up to 54% from 38%. And basically they're not doing much. They're not doing in containing ISIS in Afghanistan. They're not doing much in containing Taliban. They're expanding, yet we call it a stalemate. I don't know why do we call this a stalemate. We have just heard that we have lost 2 districts in Ghazni province. We were about to lose the whole Western Farah province a week back. We have district lost in Jurjan and Faryab. When we talk about sovereignty, nation state and sovereignty, we're losing that. I don't know why we call it a stalemate. I think this is time where we need to buckle up, where the National Unity Government needs to buckle up. They need to give up this petty politics that they are involved in, and really focus on the security of Afghanistan, the Afghan people. We have civilian casualties that are completely unheard of.
I'll have to go to
and yet we are busy in petty politics.
Sure.
Those two members and presidential palace, they're busy whether we need to put Afghan on citizenship cards or not.
I have one question for...
Embarrassing.
I have one question for Omar. Omar, the Americans sending more troops, do you think that a military option is still a viable option, given the fact that we've seen thousands and thousands of international forces in 2007, 8, 9, 10? The outcome, the same. The Taliban still have the upper hand.
I don't think it's the numbers that really count. It's the intention and how you use these elements, whether they're foreign or whether they're Afghan. Obviously, security is a major concern. It's the number one concern, and it means that we have to do what it takes to make sure that the situation does not get worse. And having said this, it has to be backed by a strategy that leads us towards solutions, that leads towards whether it's political solutions, there's economic issues in the country that are very severe, there are regional issues that have to be dealt with, and it's a complex situation. But at the same time, yes, we have to take baby steps in order to advance the cause of peace. But the cause of peace cannot be served just by talking about it and by having people gather around the table. We have to know what they want and how to resolve some of the issues that are outstanding, and make sure that each player understands that they have a role to play in all of this. Now, the unity government has issues, but the unity government, there's no immediate alternative to that. So we shouldn't be really discussing things that are not immediate.
Omar Samad, Habib Wardak, Michael Semple, thank you very much indeed. We're running out of time, but definitely looking forward to seeing you in the near future to continue our discussion about Afghanistan and its future. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.